I was just doing a prep call with someone who will be on a upcoming episode yesterday, and she goes, "What a cool job you have that you get to talk to all these people and learn from all these super smart people." But yeah, it definitely helps me keep a finger on the pulse of what's going on in our market. It also helps me understand not only the problems that our target audience is facing, but how they talk about them.
Every B2B marketing team faces challenges when they have to do more with less. Should you build skills internally? Should you find a freelancer? Should you search for the right agency? This is Tech Qualified, a podcast for the scrappy B2B marketing teams. In each episode, Meredith Metsker, a senior content leader at a tech company, and Justin Brown, a marketing agency owner, uncover how marketing teams generate qualified opportunities with limited resources. Every episode helps you get one step closer to winning over your ideal customers.
Hello and welcome to the relaunch of Tech Qualified. I'm Justin Brown, and I'm joined by my co-host, Meredith Metzger.
Hey, everyone.
This show is brought to you by New North. New North specializes in working with B2B marketers who have to do more with less. When you partner with New North, you turn your small, scrappy marketing team into a growth engine. So this, as I said, is the relaunch of Tech Qualified. Tech Qualified was around for about 200 episodes where my previous co-host, Tristan, and I would interview VPs of marketing and CMOs, kind of everything marketing. This was like 2018 to 2020. It was a big part of our not only like demand gen strategy and thought leadership and what have you, but also like a big part of our lead gen strategy at the time. Look, we were a very little known agency. We needed to find ways to have conversations with people. And it was very useful to go in and have a 60-minute conversation with CMOs and VPs of marketing. And what we quickly learned through 200 episodes, so I don't know how quickly it was that we learned, but what we quickly learned was that like really where people needed help. And we narrowed in and niched in on creating content for people. So we essentially productized the podcast service that we were running as our content initiative. When I talked to Meredith for the first time on recorded content, because I knew we had this conversation, it was around how starting with problems and issues and actually having a podcast that meant something and content that meant something was just so much more valuable, which is really the reason that this podcast originally got shut down. I was like, I just don't feel like I am appealing to a segment of the market. We're telling very broad stories. We're having conversations. I'm saying, hey, like, how does sales and marketing interact at your company? And I could only ask that question. I don't know that I can ever ask it again because I've asked it so many times. And so I did the complete opposite. And I launched recorded content, which was a podcast for B2B marketers who are running or interested in running a podcast, and they work on small marketing teams of 1 to 5. So like basically the complete polar opposite podcast of a broad CMO podcast down to like the very narrow niche of small marketing teams, B2B podcast, etc. And on that podcast, I had Meredith, and we found that we both really liked having those kind of niche shows. We liked telling stories. We liked having podcasts that started with problems, which was a big thing I started doing on recorded content, was like starting everything with like problem. It comes from a journalism background, which both Meredith and I have. So, really the question of why we wanted to relaunch it was, one, I finally convinced Meredith to do a content series with me, but we also see things very much through the same lens when it comes to marketing. So Meredith is in a content role. And with that, I'll kind of kick it to you a little bit, Meredith, just to talk about maybe some of your philosophy on marketing in terms of where content plays its role. And then I'll jump in, I think, with kind of how I see it being a part of a growth agency. So with that, Meredith, introduce yourself on Tech Qualified and let's jump into it.
Sure. Well, I'm super happy to be here. I'm so glad you asked me to co-host this podcast. I know we've been looking for the right opportunity to work together, so I'm really glad that this came along. In terms of my approach to content, like as Justin mentioned, I have a background in journalism. I was a reporter for a daily newspaper for several years before making the transition into marketing. And so I still take a very journalistic approach to content, even to this day. I really like to focus on adding value to the customer, to the audience, whoever I'm talking to. And as Justin mentioned, I like to start with the problem. In journalism, we call this the inverted pyramid. You start with the most important information up top. So I still take that approach. I'm still focused on facilitating subject matter expertise because, as any content marketer knows, you cannot be a subject matter expert in everything. And chances are, if, for example, you go and work for a cybersecurity company, you're not going to be a subject matter expert in cybersecurity. So, how do you create content that's valuable to your audience? Well, you go to the audience, you go and you figure out a way to facilitate that subject matter expertise, whether that's through an interview driven podcast like we'll be doing here with Tech Qualified, or through blog posts or webinars or however you want to do it. In my mind, really great content is about facilitating subject matter expertise rather than trying to pretend that you have it when you don't. So that's kind of just a quick overview. I don't know if there's more you want to dig into there, Justin.
Yeah, for sure. It's so interesting to me when we get a new client that comes to us. And so what we do at New North is we focus on helping small, scrappy marketing teams of 0 to 5 people. So people who come to me, I talk to CEOs, I talk to small marketing teams, and they come and I always find it interesting when people come and they're like, I want to run a paid media campaign. And I'm like, great, we got to start with content. And they're like, no, 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 no. I'm like, we don't need that. We just need paid media. I'm like, well, what are you going to say to people? How are you going to appeal? And it's like, well, that's what we're leaning on you to do, is to come up with the ad copy. And to me, everything stems from marketing. And what I tell people is, you don't come to me to do paid media. You don't come to me to do content. You don't come to me to run an ABM campaign. You come to me to do good marketing. And good marketing really starts with being able to appeal as a subject matter expert or what have you to this audience. And so we really have this like three-pronged approach. So at the center, everything should start with your customer. It should appeal to them. Your brand should appeal to them. Your product should appeal to them. Anything that you're doing from content should appeal to these people. And then it goes to the owned experiences. So owned experiences are blog on your website, podcast or video series, newsletter. Any owned experience that you have needs to appeal right back to those people at the center, your customer. And then from there, you have those amplification experiences, which is paid media, social media, SEO or organic content, ABM, or some sort of outbound. But they all need to work together, where you have the customer at the center, you have the owned experiences, that's the content. So when someone comes to me for ABM or somebody comes to me for paid media, my response to them is the first thing that we need to do is come up with a content plan. And then constantly, I shoot myself in the foot in many ways by saying that, but I know I have to, because I can't create good marketing without good content. So someone comes to me, I'm like, okay, let's figure out first, who's your customer? They're at the middle. Great. Now we need to create content for them. We need to create those owned experiences. And then from there, we can amplify. So if you want to do paid media, ironically, we have to start with content. If you want to do ABM, we have to start with content. If you want to do social media, we have to start with content. And it's why I find myself in many cases engaging with content marketers. You, Camille Trent, who runs Content Logistics, Joe Michalowski, who runs Content Head. He also runs the Marketers in Demand newsletter. This show is also on Marketers in Demand, by the way. You should subscribe to the newsletter that we have. I find myself interacting a lot with content marketers because I feel like it is the core component of where marketing has to start. And I remember those first conversations that we had, Meredith, where I had you on recorded content. And I couldn't remember if you had inspired some of recorded content or helped me to really refine some of my thought process, but really is starting with, when you have that customer, what are they running into? What keeps them up at night? What bothers them? And then telling those stories. And that's what I hope to do on this podcast, and is really to really work through some of your thought process on how we can start at problems. So Meredith, my question to you here, when you're creating a new content piece, and I want to look at this more, and that's what the show is going to be about. And I think both of us, and we can get into this shortly, is like how we're both going to learn from this as well. But is how when you're starting a content piece, how you land on what the problem may be that you wanna tackle.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's all about just asking the right questions early on in the process. So if it's a podcast, for example, we run a podcast at my company. The company is called UConnect, but the podcast is called the Career Everywhere Podcast. And before every episode, I'm doing a prep call with the guest and I am asking those questions like, hey, what what's your biggest problem? How are you dealing with it? What does it mean for the students you're trying to support? And so I'm really digging in before we even start the like content creation process. Like I'm digging into what they're really struggling with and trying to zero in on that story right away. Because again, that's kind of my natural instinct is to find the story. And I think a lot of that comes down to just the prep process. Again, doing prep calls before the actual interview. If you're doing a case study, maybe you're doing a set of, or like you're talking with them before the case study interview. And again, you're trying to zero in on that beforehand so that when you actually start the content creation process, you are already there.
Yeah, one of the things that we're really trying to bring out in this show is going to be things that are the perspective of someone who is an in-house marketer in Meredith and someone who is an agency marketer in myself. So I own two agencies, both Motion and New North, and then Meredith works at UConnect and has other experiences working as an in-house marketer at different B2B tech companies. So it's going to be very interesting to see the stuff, and it's something I'm very excited to learn about because Meredith is actually my ICP and the people who we would typically sell to. So it'll be very interesting to hear, what her approaches are towards marketing as an in-house marketer versus the approaches as someone who works in agency marketing. It's funny you bring up prep calls. One of the things that we've actually started doing, Meredith, is we have all of our client meetings for the most part on Riverside now. Not weekly meetings, but like kickoff call. We turn our kickoff call into content, right? So we're asking questions about what their customers are going through, what they're dealing with, what have you. We host that conversation on Riverside, turn our kickoff call with a new client. We turn around a blog, like a 2,000 word blog post in like a week, along
Oh.
with supporting video content. Like there's so many things you can do in marketing to get started with actions faster. And it all stems from those owned experiences. We delivered a set of video assets to a client after a kickoff recently, and they were like, I mean, this is great. We're coming to you because I have many clients who come to me and they're like, we came to you for leads, not content. I'm like, that's great. And I
Yeah,
appreciate
let's
that.
back up and let's start with
Yeah,
the content.
leads are a trailing indicator. Content is the leading indicator. And for anyone listening, it's like you have to take actions to create reactions, right? To me, content is the action that you have to do to then create the reaction, which is the lead. But it's very hard to get that message across sometimes. But it was funny when I got this question, which is like, these are great. These videos are cool. Like, what are we going to use them for? And I was like, what are you going to use them for?
What are you not going to use them
Yeah,
for?
so if we go back to my wheels, right? So there's a visual that I have that I'll pass along to our team. We'll see if we can get it into some of the assets. But it's essentially two wheels that work together, right? On the left side, that's your owned media wheel, right? So podcast, new video series, website, blog, newsletter, whatever. And then you have as I mentioned, those amplification experiences, which is, social media, anything, social media, paid media, outbound calling, outbound emailing, ABM campaigns, things like that, like actions you're taking to try and generate whatever your results metrics are. And so I was like, I mean, let's go around the wheel. I mean, we can use them in organic social. We can use videos in organic social, as well as some of the copy in organic social. We can use some of literally what you said because I interviewed you. Essentially, that was your kickoff call. I'm trying to ask you about everything that keeps your customers up at night, blah, blah, blah. Like I can use your literal language within ads. I can also use both videos that we created and standalone images within your ads. We can then use the copy within your ABM campaign that we're running. I mean, and then we're going to create a blog post around it that hopefully will drive SEO because you're talking about, and I'm not talking necessarily about like as tactical, like keyword based SEO, although we do look for some of that stuff, but really just trying to write in the voice of your customer, which is what you're talking about. So then we'll have a 2,000 word blog post. So we just hit organic social. What are you going to do with them? We just hit organic social, paid social, outbound, and content, and your blog, all with one action that you didn't even know you were on Riverside. They probably thought we were on Riverside because it was, I don't know, the alternative to Zoom that we're using. Although we do say like, hey, we might use this for something. So like maybe show up and be on camera and show up in collared shirt. But yeah, I think it's always fascinating that people see these silos of marketing is different. What's it like at UConnect for you, Meredith, with because what's the size of your team? 2?
We are 3 now. We just
3
hired a
now.
product marketing manager, so we're at 3.
So how does content work with the broader picture at UConnect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we built out a pretty cool content program, so I'm excited to kind of walk everyone through it. So we use a podcast as our pillar piece of content. And again, this is an interview-driven podcast. We're interviewing our target audience, which are career services leaders in colleges and universities. So everything is based off of this podcast. We record audio and video because it gives us twice as much content to work with. From each podcast episode, we are trying to write like one article based on the themes covered in the podcast. So that's one thing. We can produce like 3 to 5 social posts based on that episode. So that's another thing. We can put the full video version of the episode on YouTube, like the second largest search engine in the world. Why not? And then going back to the article, like from that article, we can produce even more social posts promoting the article. We can embed video clips into that article. We can put those clips on YouTube and on social. Like there's just so many uses, and it all starts from the podcast. And then we also have a newsletter that we kind of use as both the content and the amplification. It is kind of sitting right on that line. So the newsletter includes a lot of the content that we're producing with the podcast, with the articles, with everything. And it's also a distribution engine for that content. So that's kind of just a quick overview of what we're doing. Everything feeds into each other, and it has to because I'm the only content marketer at UConnect. So everything really has to feed into each other, has to be repurposable. Yeah, we're just trying to squeeze as much value out of that podcast as we possibly can.
Yeah. And it's something I talk to people about so often because I think that so this podcast is going to be for small marketing teams of 0 to 5. I mean, that is look, I had recently a top 5 SaaS company that probably has like a 50-person marketing team reach out and submitted a contact form on our site. And most people would be like, oh my gosh, like I'm noticed by recognizable software brand. And for me, it was the opposite. I was like, not going to be a fit for what we're looking to do and how we help people. And the way that, because the reason is because those teams, they are siloed and they're able to have like 5-10 people in each area of like, this is our writing team, 6 people. This is our video team. It's 8 people, whatever. We don't have that luxury, right? I work with small teams of 0 to 5, Meredith's on a team of 3. And that's really who our audience is going to be. And we want to talk about ways that audience can be helped. And one of the things that I see so often is when people are working on small teams, they think that they have to go after a channel. They're like, my team is small, so we're going to do paid media. That's going to be our focus is paid. Or our focus is going to be outbound. I'm going to hire a calling agency, or I'm going to run an outbound emailing campaign, and that's where we're going to put our focus. And one of the things I want to do on this podcast is to share success stories of people who are able to do all of the things within small teams. And really the way to do that is that you have to have content first that then feeds those other channels without taking other actions. One of the things I told Meredith about was I was running a play, essentially. That's what we call them at New North. We call them plays that we do for our clients, where we have like one thing that will spearhead like 3 different other initiatives. And it's huge for us and for our clients. But everything that we do for our clients, we test on ourselves first. So one of the plays that I ran was leveraging an owned media series, tech qualified. More broadly, it was actually for marketers in demand. So our ICP across all of our shows, Marketers in Demand, for those of you who don't know, Marketers in Demand is the media entity run by myself and my business partner. We have 10 shows, this being one of them: Anonymous Marketer, Content Logistics, Taking the Lead, Content Head, Recorded Content. Can I name them all? I hope I'm not leaving anybody out.
Direct.
Direct, Creative Operations. Actually, trailer dropped today. The actual first episode dropped today. It'll probably be on episode 2 or 3 by the time this releases. We're constantly releasing new shows. And so what I did was I built out this own media entity. I'm running an ABM campaign, and I'm sending out, hey, are you interested in talking to us about working with us? Okay, no, or no response, as is very typical of sending a cold email. And then it's, well, hey, have you checked out Marketers in Demand? Maybe you are running into some things and the content can help you. No response. Well, hey, maybe you're like so good at this that you would be interested in telling other people about what it is that you're doing. And then all of a sudden you get responses, and people are like, oh yeah, I'd be open to talking on one of your podcasts. And oh, by the way, which is a response that I've gotten to a handful, I've heard of 2 or 3 of them. I've heard of Direct with Karina and Taylor, or I've heard of Content Logistics, or I've heard of the Anonymous Marketer, and now I've got an intro call. And it's just constantly using this, like using everything. Native Americans known for, using every piece of an animal that they kill, because you can wear the fur, or you can create a spoon or a bowl or something like that. I think it's very much should be the same way with small marketing teams of 0 to 5, is like, we can only take but so many actions, but I don't think that siloed actions are where you're going to see success. Like if you're like, when people come to me and they're like, I just want you to run a paid media campaign on LinkedIn. And I'm like, so you just want me to turn on a paid media. Yeah. And then I'm going to be held to the success metrics of this. I have no interview. I don't know what people are searching. I mean, maybe I do, maybe I don't. But the long and the short of it being like, what is the creative? How are we going to get through to people? We need to create content first, other than pulling up and down, what we're putting into it. And one of the things is, I think there are people out there that are very good at that kind of thing. They're going to be very expensive. I know what some other agencies charge, paid media agencies charge, with some very popular people out in the B2B marketing space. My clients typically aren't spending that kind of money and don't have that kind of investment to put into what they're doing in these channels. And they just need good marketing. They don't need good paid media. They think they do, but what they need is good marketing. And it really starts with those, I don't want to use the word flywheel, because they're not really flywheels. They're like 2 wheels of a car almost, to make it go forward, rather than like a unicycle. And a unicycle you can push over with one hand. That'll be, there's a good analogy for you. But anyway, yeah. So that's kind of my view on how small marketing teams have to use one thing to do all the things, because to be successful, you still have to do it all. And teams like yours, Meredith, you're being asked to do the same thing that 50-person marketing team is doing. There's no channels that you're being asked, oh, don't worry about it, we're small. I mean, you have to do social, you have to do paid, you have to do content.
Yeah, like
the same things.
I'm still held to very specific metrics that I got to hit, and I have to figure out how to do it. Yeah.
And so your team is VP of marketing, you and product marketer. Can you talk a little bit about like the delineation of responsibilities of those major marketing tasks within the organization?
Sure. Yeah. So our VP of marketing is responsible for like the overall marketing strategy and vision. She is incredible. Her name is Ashley Safransky. You should follow her on LinkedIn if you don't already. And so she's responsible for that overall big picture. And then me and the content side, I'm responsible for, I could even just run through the metrics that I'm being held to, which I think is kind of interesting for a content marketer. But I'm being measured on inbound website leads. So people that come into our website and fill out the like requested demo form. I'm responsible for that. I'm responsible for website traffic to like all pages of our website, podcast downloads, newsletter subscribers, and LinkedIn impressions. So those are all the metrics that I am responsible for. So I'm trying to my job is to figure out how do I use content to drive all of that inbound interest. And so yeah, again, we're using the podcast as kind of the pillar piece there. And I I do want to talk for a second, or maybe we can do this later, but I do want to talk for a second about why we chose the podcast as a pillar piece.
There's not gonna be a better place than
Okay.
here.
All right.
Let's do it.
So a lot of it was just really deeply understanding our audience. So again, our audience is career services leaders at colleges and universities. And we know that this particular group really loves to learn from each other. And there's not this weird competitive spirit you see in the private sector where, one company doesn't want to share their secret sauce with another company. In higher ed and in career services specifically, they are very willing to share their secret sauce. They want to. They want to help their peers at other institutions. They want to learn so that they can apply those things to their work. And we know that they love to network together. And so we were thinking, okay, what kind of content could facilitate that? Could facilitate that learning amongst each other outside of in-person conferences, which only happen a few times a year in that industry. And so we landed on an interview-driven podcast where we interview members of that target audience, and we're trying to appeal to that same audience. And so it was, again, facilitating that subject matter expertise. And to me, an interview-driven podcast just made so much sense. Like, what better way to make sure that our content is relevant to our target audience than to get the content from the target audience, And then from there, we just built out all the content waterfall, so to speak, all that other content. But the podcast was really not just because we wanted to start a podcast for the sake of doing it, but because we knew that that medium would likely play very well with this audience.
It's always been interesting to me. We've had people who come and they talk to us and they're like, "Hey, I need to refine my messaging before we get started on this kind of thing." And I'm like, it's so backwards. You should start your podcast video series, content initiative, whatever it may be. It should stem around talking to people. Just about everything that we write stems from an interview with the client, a client's customer, or a subject matter expert on the client's team or within their space. That is how we're able to write in the style, really say things that matter to that audience. Having someone sit down and write a keyword-based blog post, or saying, we're going to sit in a room, me, Meredith, and two other people are going to sit in a room. We're going to talk for a day about what our messaging should be without engaging with the people in the space. I'm constantly evaluating my messaging for what's on my website in two ways. One is through content. It's interviewing people and talking to them and doing things like this podcast, and sales calls. So one of the things you'll hear on this meeting or on this podcast is and one of the reasons I want to run this podcast is I started my career more heavily in like sales or like in a kind of CRO type role. I worked with my business partner at our first agency where I worked for him, and we took that. It was like head of sales, whatever, small agency, but we took it into being 5,000. And then we opened our own agency, whatever. But I served much more on like that sales side. I come from a journalism background, and I don't know your full story on why you left the journalism field. But for me,
Oh,
it was
man.
like, yeah. So I was in radio, which is funny that I wound up with a microphone back on my face. But I was in radio, and a buddy of mine is like working for his third year as a producer on a sports show. And I'm like, how much money do you make? Whatever. He's like, I make $8 an hour, and he works 4 hours a day. And then he goes and works at the Marriott. And I was like, this is not for me.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, so what am I going to do? Right. I went to school for journalism. And now I have no skills. I didn't become an accountant or do anything that is like an accountant, a lawyer or whatever, a doctor or what have you. So I got into sales like people do. And so this show, what I'm very excited about for myself is to continue to build out my marketing knowledge. I mean, I've been in marketing now and owning marketing agencies for the last 7 to 8 years, very much on the agency side. So it's going to be a lot of fun for me. And so what am I going to do, right? So I'm constantly selling to marketers. I have probably 12 to 15 hours of sales calls a week, which is great. Marketing's working for us if I'm having that many sales calls. I'm having like 12 to 15 hours of sales calls a week where I learn a ton from my ICP. And then I want to run a podcast where I continue to hear from them, talk to them, what have you. And that is how I will develop my messaging for all of the materials I make. My business partner, Tristan, who helps me with a lot of our sales materials, like the sales enablement materials, I think he hears from me once a week that we need to refine our sales deck. And like that happens because I'm talking to the people in the space. It just really resonates a lot with me, Meredith, when you say, you know, that's how we develop what we say to people like that. Those the pillar piece is what drives a lot of that. And I think if people know it's okay to go out and talk to people, it will help their marketing materials, their sales materials, their website, what have you.
Mhm. And it leads to great content, and ultimately, that's what people want, is great content. Like, we only just started experimenting with paid ads, but, like, we drove 1,000 subscribers to our newsletters fully organically because it was good content, and it was based on insights and learnings from people that our audience wanted to learn from.
Yeah. And that's typically where we've always started as well, is like we start with the own side of it, creating good content, whether it is, I mean, we've created a B2B podcasting course that was like 50 videos. We created a video course on creating videos. And that was a while back, like the 10 things you should think about when going into creating a video. And that was like back when branded video, people were spending like $15,000-$20,000 to get you show up with a big camera crew. That's
Wow.
actually where what we were before we were a podcast agency. But yeah, I mean, just starting with content and then you can turn that into all sorts of things rather than we need to do a paid media strategy. What are we going to do for paid media? It's like, well, what are we going to do to break through to your people? So
Yeah. Have you tested your messaging at all through any kind of content or any type of interaction with your customer? No? Then you are not ready for
just
paid
write an
media.
ad, Meredith, and have it appeal to the people. And then they're going to fill out the forms and we're all going to make a lot of money. And it's just,
Uh,
while I wish that I had the ROI of an ad across the board, which is many times what I'm asked, it just doesn't work that way. You have to figure out what appeals to people. If there was a silver bullet that was put $1 in, get $2 out, everybody would do it. And the reality is you have to figure out how to talk to people. And to figure out how to talk to people, I'm talking, from an outbound or from the word message you're putting out into the world, you have to talk to people yourself. You have to do interviews. You have to have conversations with your ideal customers. You have to listen to sales calls. You have to be on sales calls. I know not every marketer is going to do that, and that's fine. But finding ways to engage with the ICP. And, over the last 6 months, so a little background here. So I bought New North with Tristan about 7 months ago now. And one of the things that we've done over the last 3 months is every one of our account, and we have one other person in leadership with us, Jacob, who runs our creative operations podcast. One of the things that we've done is we've all allocated ourselves to accounts within the organization. So we have our strategists who are running accounts, but then they have a backup in someone, either Tristan, Jacob, or myself. And we're on every client call. So like no strategist goes into a client meeting without one of us there. And it was one of my favorite things about Chris Walker during the pandemic was when I would listen to his content, I knew he was hands-on, and I don't listen to as much of his stuff anymore just because life and whatever, he may be doing the exact same thing. But I liked at the time, I knew he was getting his hands dirty in the work. And that's how he was developing his philosophies. And over the last 3 months, since we've implemented this, no strategist is going to have to go to a client meeting without one of the three of us there. And we split up, like, let's say we have 25 accounts. We just split it, divided by 3, and we picked some, whatever. And it's been incredibly eye-opening to just sit there and just hear constantly what these people are saying and then be able to refine what we're doing, how we help people. And I just know, because I just know people who work at tech companies, my CEO hasn't sat in on a sales meeting, hasn't talked to a customer in 5 years. And I'm like, well, but yet that person, which is a term I recently learned, but that same person will swoop and poop the marketing materials. And it's like, well, you're not talking to anybody. You talk to the board and like the VP of finance, but yet you're gonna tell me what should be in the marketing materials. I mean, if you're not having conversations with the people in the space, which Meredith, I imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you are viewed in many cases, a person like yourself, and you can tell me if this is true or not for you, is viewed in just an incredibly high or like an incredibly good light within the organization because you kind of like hold the keys to like what the people are saying because you're the one who's out there doing the market research and talking to people, and especially at tech companies, right? We're a services company. So we can have conversations with our customers all the time. I mean, we have weekly meetings also. There's an abundance of engagement with customers, and then there's the sales calls. But a lot of times at a tech company, you're not engaging with the customer nearly as much as a services company would. And so someone like yourself, Meredith, you hold a lot of those keys. And I know Joe is the same way. Mosaic, like, and he's the one who I mentioned who runs Content Head and writes our newsletter. Like, he holds a lot of those keys because he's the one really out on the ground floor having the conversation with the people in the space, with the people in the space. So I'm curious if that's accurate or if you feel that way. Like, do you have kind of the pulse on the market? What does that feel like?
And I think I could still improve in how I disseminate the information that I pick up. Right now, we're just telling people like, "Hey, listen to the podcast." If you
Yeah.
work in sales, if you work in customer success, if you like pretty much anybody in the company, you should go listen to the podcast. Like, I think we're gonna make it part of our onboarding process for new
I
employees.
was just gonna
Yeah.
say I've actually heard a podcast being used. I've launched, I don't know, like 70 podcasts at this point because Motion, the other agency, is a podcast agency. So I've seen podcasts used in tons of ways that I never
Mhm.
would have imagined. But yeah, creating that internal IP is amazing because it's also your opportunity to teach your own employees. Like, what do we do? Well, go listen
Go
to the
listen to the
podcast. Like,
podcast.
Ben, who works for us, who heads up our podcasting arm, when he came on, he was not a podcaster or a marketer in terms of his background. And I was like, well, what better way to get you up to speed on a lot of this stuff? Like, he's a master project manager, things like that. There were other reasons that we brought him in. And I was like, go listen to every episode of Recorded Content. It's a podcast about podcasting. There's 125 episodes. Go start hitting play. You're going to hear 125 different stories about how people are using podcasts within their business. You really probably don't even have to ask me anything after that. You're going to have
Right?
me on. I think I hosted half of them and Tristan hosted the other half. And then you have all the people out there that we talked to. There you go. We did internal episodes of he and I talking. We did episodes where solo episodes talking about a big idea. We did episodes that were interview episodes. I mean, I couldn't even cover the amount of information that's in there in an onboarding if I wanted to. So it's fascinating the way that you can use this content, not only for external purposes.
Mhm. Yeah, and if you're looking for a job, you should be checking out the company's podcast if they have one.
Yeah.
Pro tip.
Cool. So on podcast, we talked a little more than I was expecting in that segment, and we're kind of coming up on time here. So there's one thing that I did want to tell the audience is one of the things that we're going to have fun with as Meredith and I continue to work together on this show is we want to have some fun with the approach to it. So we think one of the things that's super interesting about the show is going to be the dichotomy between Meredith working at a B2B tech company on a small team and me working with B2B tech companies that have small teams. I think that's going to be fun. The other thing we're going to do is for every interview that we have, we're going to do 2 episodes. One episode is going to be the interview. And then the follow-up episode is going to be some reflection on what we talked about, because one of the things we're going to do is we want to tackle issues. We're going to talk to people not, hey, you're a VP of marketing at ABC Software on a small team. Tell us about your story and your background and who you are and what you do. We may get into those things, but it'll be, okay, you have a small team of 2, but we noticed that you have this rockin' content series that fuels your paid media. Can you walk us through what that looks like on a daily, weekly basis? How does that fuel your paid media? Blah, blah, blah. Like, really tackling issues. How were you able to grow your team from 0 to 3 and get buy-in from the CEO that you need, whatever it may be. Those are the types of topics that we're going to tackle with our interviews. And then Meredith and I, in a follow-up episode, are going to review that on our own, talk about things that we may have done, that we think, what have you. So it's going to be interview-based, and then it's going to be Meredith and me, and then interview-based. And then who knows from there. One of the things that I like to say to people when they're launching podcasts is you don't have to narrow in on one specific structure. So that's what we're thinking out of the gates. I'm looking forward to it. I think you are too as well,
Oh,
Meredith.
absolutely.
Well, Meredith, that's it for episode 1 or 201 or whatever it is. Like I mentioned, don't delete your IP. You don't know when it'll come back and work for you. We've kept this RSS feed now for 6 years, and we're launching it back up. We're super excited. Until next time, thanks for listening to Tech Qualified.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for checking out Tech Qualified. This show is brought to you by New North, a marketing agency that helps turn your small, scrappy marketing team into a growth engine. To find out more about New North or check out more episodes of this show, go to newnorth.com/techqualified.